So this is a briefing about type conversion for instructors. So when we're dealing with type conversions as instructors, the main thing that we've got to do is to evaluate this new type with a view to brief another pilot. And very specifically what we need to do is to work out what the differences between what they've flown before are and this new type. Why the differences? Well, because if they're surprised by something, or surprised by the position of a control in the glider, or an attitude of flight, say, or what happens when they open the air brakes or something like that, then they may well get overloaded. And if they're overloaded, if their workload is too high, then it might be that the pilot is simply not suitable to fly this new type. So if there are too many differences between what they've flown before and this new type, then it might be that you suggest to the pupil that they fill in some of those gaps. They fill in some of the differences by flying perhaps an intermediate type that teaches them the differences. And that type hopefully would be a two-seater, but not necessarily. It might be that there's an intermediate type of glider that they can fly that fills in some of those differences but won't overload them. So you could suggest that to them. So how are we going to actually deal with the differences then that we're going to brief the student over? Well, the first thing to do is look at the glider on the ground. So consider yourself inexperienced. Some of the minor things that you might pick up, you might discount as very, very small, but they may be a factor for your student. So that's why the comments there, consider yourself inexperienced. Just remember that your student's not as experienced as you, and small things might increase their workload by a disproportionate amount. It's always a good idea to read the flight manual. It has very practical advice in there about things like jettisoning the canopy, as we've seen on the right of the slide there, speeds to fly, limitations of the glider, and all the rest of it. It also may give you some pointers as to what the perhaps even idiosyncrasies of the aircraft might be. But of course, the flight manual is not the full story, so get some advice from somebody that's flown it, or fly it yourself. Side walk around is always good because it can give you a clue as to what the gliders might handle like on the ground and in the air. For instance, does it sit on its nose wheel with an occupant, or is it on the tail? Has it got a massive tailplane, big or small air brakes, and just things like that. You can just get some clues from having a look around the outside and thinking objectively about it. Obviously, looking at the cockpit is really important. Where are all the primary controls? There are some gliders out there with primary controls not in the middle. They're actually on the side of the aircraft. But quite often it's the secondary controls that we're looking at, air vents, where the wheel brakes are, where the controls for the instruments are. How do you get the basic information out of the instruments? The last thing you want the student to be doing is fiddling around on the instrument panel trying to tune the radio or trying to get something sensible out of the vario that they need. So set all that up for them and make sure that they know how to use it on the ground. The BGA has a minimum cockpit load over the minimum for flight. So if you've got a light pilot, it's worth looking at that. It's in managing flying risks. So make sure that the ballast is appropriate and in the centre of the CFG range somewhere. And also a good question to ask is what is the launch type going to be? So if you've got a student that's really experienced on the winch, then perhaps winching is the way to go. But we'd always suggest that if possible, the aerotow is used only because everything happens a bit slower. But of course, if the student needs to be very current at aerotowing in order to do that. And also, it's a very good idea to make sure that their left hand is on the release, as usual, in case anything goes wrong, because we don't want to tip the tug up. So just dealing with the individual bits in the cockpits, here's the K23. We're going to compare the K23 and the Junior a little bit at least. So first of all, where's the wheel brake? We talked about tertiary controls or secondary controls. Wheel brake in the K23 is on the end of the air brake travel, which is different to the Junior, of course. The K23 also, when we get there, has sits on its nose wheel, of course, when there's an occupant in the aircraft, which means that the stick position might be different at the beginning of the ground run, for instance. The air vent is in a different place in the K23 to the Junior, or certainly the control for the air vent is. The instrument layout is different in these two aircraft. Even at this one club, the instrument layout is different. So that's something to think about. Make sure that the student knows where the ASI is, especially. The release is in a different place in both gliders, and the trimmer is in the same place, but in the K23 it's just got a friction control on it, whereas in the Junior it actuates in a different way. So there are some differences even just looking around the cockpit there.
In the Junior, a bit different to the K23.
Compare that with the Junior.
The wheel brake and the
here are some of the
differences
differences between the two gliders.
The instrument layout's a little bit different. Stick position and attitude's probably a little bit different, even with the tail on the ground. The vent and the release, as we discussed earlier, in different places, and the canopy lock's different as well, which is always worth thinking about. The trim we discussed earlier, again, it's in the same place, but it operates differently. You need to push down the mushroom thing in the middle in order that we can move it. So yeah, there's a few little differences there, even though they're pretty similar kind of training gliders.
So let's have a think about the differences that might catch people out actually in the air. So the control harmonization and coordination might be a bit different between two types. It might feel different at various speeds. For instance, in a standard Cirrus, there's very little difference actually in the elevator stick load between very slow speeds and fairly quick speeds. So that might catch somebody out if they're used to, when they're going fast, putting a bit of load on the stick instead of just thinking about how far they're going to move it. What warnings do you get before the aircraft stalls? Is there plenty of warning? What's the student used to already? If they're used to something which has got a really good stall warning and they're going to something that's got a very subtle stall warning, then might that be a problem for them? The spinning characteristics, or certainly the beginning of the spin characteristics, might be different between the two, and that might catch somebody out as well. It says turn reversals there, and what that means is, I guess, how quickly can you roll a glider from one heading to another, or one bank angle to another. I flew a glider once in the mountains. I won't tell you the type, but I was actually very surprised at my first approach to the hill, how slow it was to roll, and it gave me a bit of a surprise actually. So that might catch somebody out. What happens when you open the air brakes? Does it pitch up? Does the glider pitch nose down? Quite often double paddle air brakes make the glider pitch up, whereas single paddle top surface only air brakes make the glider pitch down. Again, what's the student used to? Are they going to end up over or under speeding on the approach because of what they're used to, perhaps? Flaps, not that common, but what do flaps do? How can you reduce the workload if it's the first experience of your student with flaps? Can you fly a flapped two-seater perhaps? There are a few around the country. Even if they can't do the takeoff and landing, it'd be useful to get a bit of experience about how they operate. The critical bits, as it says there, are the launch and the landing, and the approach and landing. So, when you open the air brakes, that's a critical thing. Does the glider pitch up and down? We've discussed that. What is the attitude like with the air brakes open? Do the flaps change the attitude if you're flying with flaps? And what is the attitude for the landing, and we'll have a look at that in a minute as well. So a follow on from the last slide, let's look at this launch and approach and landing, because that really is the critical bit of the flight. So what is the takeoff attitude? Have a think about that. What are you going to brief the student? You know, it needs to be balanced on the main wheel, whether it's winching or aerotowing, but can you simulate that attitude? So in other words, if the glider sits like the K23 on the nose wheel, can you balance it on the main wheel so that the student can see what it looks like? Where do the controls need to be? Well, I was a bit reluctant about talking about where the stick needs to be. You know, I'd rather talk about, you know, the result, what does the attitude of the glider need to be. But early in the launch, you probably could talk about, you know, so we need to keep the stick right back to get the nose wheel off the ground as soon as we can, perhaps. Or if the glider sits on the tail wheel, just start with the stick in the middle, and then, you know, balance it on the main wheel once you've felt what's going on. What happens when the air brakes are opened on the approach? Yeah, does it pitch up, pitch down? What does it feel like? Can you practice at height? If you're aerotowing, then you probably can aerotow high enough to ask the student to open the air brakes in the air. Obviously, they need to be careful. You need to be able to trust that they're not going to get out of range if they are going to practice that. And what is the landing attitude? Again, can it be simulated? In, for instance, the junior, when you sat in the cockpit, well, that is your landing attitude because the tail's on the ground. In the K23, you need to lean on the tail. So, you know, thinking about those things is pretty important, I think, because those are the times when things can get a bit fraught and people can end up having an accident close to the ground. So here you can see our student sat in the K23, and there's an instructor on the tail boom just simulating the difference between the landing attitude, the tail wheel on the ground, and the attitude with the nose wheel sat on the ground. So it just gives the student some idea of where the landing attitude is going to be, that tail wheel on the ground. So let's round this up with the actual briefing that you're going to give to a pupil. First of all, you need to make sure that the pupil's got the background knowledge to fly the new type. So make sure that they've read the flight manual and that they sit in the cockpit and figure out where everything is. And that they can get the information they need from any complicated vario systems, radios and all that kind of stuff in the cockpit. Once they've got all that stuff sorted, before they actually do the flight, I would always give them a maximum of 3 critical things that might catch them out on a particular flight. So let's say somebody's gone from a K13 to a K23, for instance. Well, what are the different things? Well, when they open the air brakes, it's going to be on the approach, possibly, especially if the winch launch. They're not going to probably have much of a chance to try this try opening the air brakes upper air. So it's quite likely that they'll end up flying too fast down the approach because the glider will pitch nose down instead of nose up when they open the air brakes. That's fine. That's the safe way, I suppose, as long as the airfield's long enough. But it's the kind of thing that you could just, ask them to watch out for on the approach, because if they get really quick, then they might end up PIOing down the airfield or something like that. The second thing I might brief them on is just the landing attitude. So lean on the tail and show them what that attitude looks like, because the seating position is going to be different in this glider to the K13. So I'll just make sure that they understand what that landing attitude is with the tail on the ground. And also, perhaps as the third thing, once you get off the top of the launch, just make sure that you calibrate that normal flying attitude for, say, 50 knots. So that might be my 3 things that I'd brief. If you end up briefing more than 3 things in your type conversion, then you've got to ask yourself, is the workload going to be too high for the student? And if it is, then you might suggest that they get a bit of extra training, either in a 2-seater that simulates one of the differences that between what they've flown before and this new type, or even a single-seater that's a bit more like what they're used to, but has some of the differences that this new type has. So that's a roundup really of the way I would brief somebody for a new type. And it does need to be reasonably brief, because if you go through too much stuff, they'll forget it. They'll forget all the critical stuff and remember all the non-critical stuff. So I hope you enjoyed this briefing about type conversion, and I hope that you managed to brief many people successfully to fly single-seaters. It's a pretty exciting time, of course. I can certainly remember my first single-seat flight, and it felt so light and so nimble and really nice to fly. So catch you on an airfield, I hope.